Good morning. It's Monday, and it's time to get to some stuff that some of you have probably been waiting for a long, long time. We're going to step outside of the classical music tradition and start talking about the different sounds that you hear in folk musics around the world, ethnomusicology. But I want to start right here in the United States. Probably the most significant music in the United States of America is a culturally mixed music. We had influences that came from Western Europe. They came from classical music in Western Europe. They came from folk music in Western Europe. And they traveled across here. We also have sounds that came from Africa that were brought here with the slaves. And they meet, they mix, they mingle, they alter one another, and they become the sounds of American music. A lot of times we'll call them just in a vast overview jazz. There's a lot more to it than just that, though. But there's a reason that it happens peculiarly here in the United States. And I don't mean peculiarly that it's bad, but that it belongs particularly here. And part of that is bound up with the fact that we brought people here against their will from Africa. And they brought with them their own backgrounds, their own traditions, their own songs, and continued using those as slaves. Now, one place in particular, one specific area, was different than the rest of the United States when this began happening, and that is Louisiana. Louisiana fell under Napoleonic law rather than British common law, and Napoleonic law treated slaves and non-citizens differently than law did in some other places. How's that? Well, you could be a free black in Louisiana. You could be a mixed race person in Louisiana and have standing and own property and have money. Because of this, there was a tiered society. You had rich Caucasian people, you had rich free blacks, you had rich mixed blood peoples. And each one of them had their own places. There were actually opera houses for the mixed blood people. And that wasn't really a problem until after the American Civil War. And after the American Civil War, it becomes a real problem. Why? Because after the war, they redefined it as saying so much as one drop of color made you colored. Now, suddenly we have people who have been on a very high tier in society squished down to the lowest tier. We have musicians who have been trained in Western music, Western instruments, no longer being allowed to play those in the places they had, mixing with sounds that came from African slaves recently freed. And those things coming together create one of the most wonderful musics ever existing. Most famous place that this happens is down at the very bottom of the Mississippi River in New Orleans. In New Orleans, we have the beginnings of Dixieland. Okay, I had to change out the battery there. And Percy wanted to say hi. So, Dixieland, which starts off in Louisiana, particularly in New Orleans, still exists in New Orleans. You can go see it any time when this whole travel ban is lifted and we can go back and see things again. And in the French Quarter is a mixture of sounds from Western Europe and from Africa, played on American instruments. One of the most important instruments for Dixieland is the banjo. Strangely enough, the banjo is not an American instrument. It is an instrument descended from what is called the inanga, or stringed instrument, in sub-Saharan Africa. You have a round drum with a neck piece and strings across that, and that instrument, brought to the United States, develops into what we call the banjo. It was one of the fundamental instruments in the small grouping that we would have for Dixieland. A lot of times you had a singer, you had a clarinet player, you had a trumpet player, you had a trombone player, you had a banjo player, and you had a drummer. And between those people, you were able to make a lot of music. Most of it was made by listening. Now, those who had come from the operatic traditions and come from the orchestral traditions were able to read music, But those who were recently freed slaves could not. Didn't make them any less great musicians, but it meant that they had to do things by ear and by improvisation rather than by reading the music, which turns out to be a really cool thing to do. So Dixieland develops, and there are examples of Dixieland for you to listen to. And then that music begins to travel the United States along with the recently freed slaves who are looking for a better life in other places. There's a great migration up to the north. And of course, the easiest way to get there, couldn't hop in your car and take the interstate, they didn't exist. The easiest way to get there was up the Mississippi River. And so you can actually follow the blooming of jazz across the country up the river. As it goes up the river, it begins to change. When you get to Memphis, you start hearing things like the Memphis Blues, which very strongly influenced by guitar playing. Guitars being added. And banjo kind of falls by the wayside. You make it up to St. Louis, and somebody gets the great idea of adding a string bass. Hey, string bass is a great sound. By the time it makes it all the way up to Chicago, you've replaced the banjo entirely. The guitar player is not the most important person, but the bass player, a piano player, and the drummer become the foundational sounds, the engine room that runs the ensemble. Now, once it makes it to Chicago, it can travel down the rail lines. To the east, it goes back to New York City, and to the west, it goes out all the way to Los Angeles in California. And jazz spreads across the country. But it's regional, and it's thought-provoking, and it's making new sounds in new places. And probably New York City is where it makes its biggest influences on people during the day. If you know the Harlem Renaissance, then you know that music is as much a part of the Harlem Renaissance as poetry. All of that is absolutely delightful music to listen to. Born out of pain, born out of suffering, come some of the most glorious sounds that you'll ever hear. I remember the first time I heard someone say this, and I think it was Little Richie who said it. Rhythm and blues, which is a large part of what jazz is, had a child. And they named that child rock and roll. And what happened was pretty simple. In a place called Memphis, Tennessee, there was a man they called the Colonel, and he noticed that little white children loved listening to black music. Now, that was strictly forbidden. We were not allowed to go and intermingle. We had this horrible thing called segregation back in the day. And little white children were not allowed to go and listen to music in a black club. But they could listen to the radio. And they listened to the radio and they fell in love with music. And the Colonel went, I've got to find somebody who can sing that music. And he found somebody. And your parents and grandparents, and great-grandparents probably by now, knew a guy whose name was Elvis Presley. And Elvis had grown up in North Mississippi, sitting on the back porch playing rhythm and blues with African-American musicians. And in doing that, he learned how to sing it, he learned how to play it. He walked into the little recording studio, Sun Studios there in Memphis one day, and made a little cheap album. I can record myself. And the Colonel heard it and fell in love with it, because here was a Caucasian, a white boy, who could sing African-American music. And the rest of that is history. Elvis made incredible amounts of money singing music, breaking what we would call the color line. There were absolutely fantastic African-American musicians living in the United States, singing jazz, singing rhythm and blues, singing gospel, all those related forms. They weren't allowed to perform in the theaters. A lot of them left the United States and traveled to Europe, particularly to France, and became incredibly famous musicians there. Jazz became one of the most popular forms of music in Europe. And still, those same musicians were not allowed to play here in the United States. Or if they were, they had to go in through the back entrance, the service. Couldn't stay at that nice hotel that they were singing at. They had to stay someplace else. Fortunately for you guys, segregation is not something that we think about anymore. It's just, we don't concern ourselves with that. But it was a real problem for music for many, many years, and it kept a lot of fantastic musicians from being able to make the amount of money that they should have been able to make with their art. I hope that you'll listen through to all of the examples that are in Canvas this week. There's some absolutely wonderful music, and you can hear it change, and I'm sure you're going to hear some things and go, wait, I know that sound. I've heard that sound all my life. Because our music today, our popular music today, definitely owes its living, its life, its breathing, its being to rhythm and blues, which owes its life to jazz, which owes its life to the African American experience. Hope you enjoy it. Have an absolutely wonderful day.